Hello and welcome to the Starting a Podcast for Beginners 5-part series. We're on stage 3 now. If you haven't seen stage 1 and 2, check the description. They're linked below. Stage 3 is where you'll be putting together all the common assets that you're going to need for all of your podcast episodes. So that's your cover art, the artwork that's going to show up in the podcast platforms, the intro and outro, and a template for your written show notes. I'm going to show you how I put these assets together. Obviously, it's up to you if you want to do all of this yourself or outsource some of it, but it's good to know the process and then you can make that decision depending on your budget and how much time you have and things. So firstly, let's talk intros and outros. So an intro and outro is like a bookend that goes at the front and the end of every single episode of your podcast that you publish. They come in lots of different forms. Some podcasts will have a new intro recorded for each episode, or they'll have a generic one that they can just paste into each episode, or maybe a combination of both. Like they might have a host read cold open explaining what's happening at the beginning of the episode, and then it goes into a general theme with a music bed, and then the outro might be a generic outro as well. So there are all sorts of options, and we are going to look at some examples, and I'm going to show you how to put them together in this video. But generally, an intro is around a half a minute long piece of audio or video, if you're doing a video podcast, that introduces your listeners to the show, just lets them know they're in the right place and lets them know what they're in for. And then an outro is a nice way of bookending the podcast, and it's also the perfect place to put in a call to action. So whatever you want the listener to do after they've listened to your podcast, you can place your call to action in the outro. So podcast intros and outros come in all sorts of different forms, and it's up to you what kind of layout for your intro and outro you want to choose. So I've just got my planner here for my podcast, and if we scroll down a little bit, you can see what format does your intro have. So here is where I've planned the sort of layout of my podcast. So every episode starts with a cold open read by myself, read by the host, describing what happens in that episode. So something to really hype up the listener right off the bat before any music or anything else comes in, just immediate context and some value as well, something to get them inspired to listen. Then in comes a general music theme with a general podcast intro that I wrote and recorded. So that just goes over what the podcast is and who it's for, basically. And then for my outro, I decided to just go with a general podcast outro as well, one that I've put together that I can use on every single episode, just plug it in at the end rather than having to record a new outro every time. And that's generally easier to do with your outro because all it's going to be is like a thank you for listening and a place to put your call to action mainly. So, and I'm going to have a music theme at the end there as well. And then I've written a little script. We'll get to that in just a moment. Just going to scroll up and let's talk about music. So for your music, if you want to use music for your intro and outro, which I do recommend because it gets the listener in the mood to listen to your podcast and sets the tone, sets the theme, and it gives it some sonic branding so they know that they're in the right place when they hear that recognizable song. So there are lots of different places where you can get your music online. I'll leave a couple of links in the description below where you can get your music from. Various music marketplaces where you can pay either a set fee or a monthly subscription to download and use this royalty-free music for your podcast. It's really important that you make sure that you have the license to use that music in a podcast, because sometimes even if you search for royalty-free music, you might find a website that says like you can use it in your projects and things, but then in the fine print it will say that you can't use it for audio only projects like podcasts. So I can't specify exactly what the terms are for each of these platforms. Just make sure you do your own research and then make sure that you've got the license to use your music, because otherwise it could cause problems like your podcast being completely taken down or you getting some kind of cease and desist. And have a think about what kind of music that would be right for your podcast. Like if you were doing a true crime podcast, you're probably not going to have something like super cheery and upbeat and at the same time, if you have a corporate podcast, you don't want something that sounds like you're coming into a comedy, or maybe you do. It depends. You know your audience and your content, what will be right for that. So for mine, I was looking for something upbeat, fun, punchy, and different from the competition as well, because that's something that will help you to stand out if your music isn't the same as everyone else within your niche. And then in terms of the script for your intro and outro, they don't need to be long at all. Ideally, you just want people to be able to click on an episode, know they're in the right place, get your sonic branding in there so they can recognize it for each episode, and then just get them in to getting that value out of your episode. You don't want them sitting there for like 2 minutes listening through to, you know, music without any vocals, like this long musical intro, and then you chuck in a few ads, and then there's a general podcast introduction. And for new listeners, it's just going to be a complete turn off. So just try and keep it brief and enticing. So for my cold opening, where I'm just describing the episode, I haven't scripted that because it depends on the episode. You can also grab a clip from the episode, like a really enticing and engaging clip that makes them want to listen more, and stick that right at the beginning before your scripted general intro. And then, yeah, so I've written a general intro and outro for the podcast. So it goes, you're listening to Podcast Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting to amplify your message and achieve your goals. So immediately that's telling the listener the podcast that they're listening to and what they can hope to get out of the podcast. And then if you're a podcaster and you want to learn from the journeys of other passionate podcasters, you're in the right place. So this is clarifying that this is the podcast for them. So if you're a podcaster, they can say yes to that. If you want to learn from the journeys of other passionate podcasters, again, this is something that can help make your listener think, yeah, that's me. I'm in the right place. But also it's in very few words describing what is actually being offered by the podcast, which is learning the journeys of other passionate podcasters. So it's quite obvious that it's going to be an interview podcast. So it's only a few seconds long, but we've got everything in there that we need. And then similarly for the outro. Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform, or you can put whatever your call to action is. So please subscribe and follow, or please visit such and such website. We'll be back next week with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting. So that's just a nice way of finishing it off and just letting the listener know that there will be another episode coming. So let's actually put the intro and outro together now. I've got Audacity open here. Whichever digital audio workstation or audio editor you want to use, you can use that. The only reason I'm using Audacity is because it's free to download on any system. So just as an example to you, I just want to show something that I know you'll be able to access if you don't have a preference for editing software just yet. And what we've got here is a recording of my intro voice. Let's just click play on that. You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting to amplify your message. So you can record your intro voice within Audacity. I go more into detail on how to record and edit and things in other videos, which I'll leave a link in the description for. But just as a brief overview, if you don't have an editing software yet, you can download Audacity from audacityteam.org and install it. And then under audio setup, just make sure in recording device, you've got your microphone selected, hit record, and then you'll be able to record your podcast intro. Then I've also dragged in the music file. Let's just turn that down a little bit because I think it's going to be quite loud, and make sure that's working. Okay, and obviously the song is much longer than the actual intro dialogue. So we're going to cut some of this off. I'm just going to drag over that and press delete. And then we're going to go back to the beginning and zoom in. And we're going to turn this right down so that it doesn't, it's not louder than the vocal. Let's have a quick listen with the vocal in there as well. You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting to amplify your message and achieve your... Okay, so it's still a little bit quiet, the vocal under there. So what we're going to do is where that vocal comes in, we're going to slightly adjust the level of the music with the envelope tool up here. So you can click the envelope tool or press F2. And where that music comes in, just going to click a couple of times so these two dots appear. And it sort of separates the audio so you can bring it down a little bit. Let's have a listen now. You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where I could probably do a little bit more than that. You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting to amplify your message and achieve your goals. If you're a podcaster and you want to learn from the journeys
so that's nice and clear. And then I'm just going to quickly select the end there and go into Effect, Audacity, and Fade Out. So we can fade out the music while the main episode comes in. And whatever DAW you're using, whatever software you're using, you'll be able to do these things in a very similar way, just fading out your music and adjusting the level as well. And then with the dialogue itself, I'm just going to add a couple of effects as well, some compression and EQ. So compression, what it does is it reduces the level of the louder parts while retaining the level of the quieter parts. So it makes a nice balanced volume overall, because you've got these parts where I've spoken a bit louder. So if we highlight our dialogue, go to Effect, Audacity, Compressor, and just have a look at this ratio option. We're going to go for 4:1, which sets how much the audio will be reduced by when the volume goes over the threshold that you've set. So let's click Apply and see what happens. And you'll see, if I just undo, you see that some of these louder parts have gotten quieter. But I'm just going to reduce the threshold a little bit more, which means that it will catch more of those peaks and compress it more. There we go. Now let's have a listen.
You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcast. If you're a podcaster and you want to learn from the journeys of...
Okay, so it's got more of a consistent volume now. And then the second effect we're going to apply is EQ. Now, if we go back into Effect and Audacity, an EQ is sort of like a very clever volume knob, which allows you to increase or decrease the level of high frequencies, treble, low frequencies, bass, and anywhere in between. And it can help to remove nasty sounds from your vocal recordings if you haven't recorded in an ideal space, and remove some of the low-end bass that you don't need in there. And it just helps it to kind of mix with the music a bit better. Now, I go into much more detail about how to mix vocal recordings in other videos that I'll link in the description below. But just to give you a general overview and just to get you started, I'm just going to show you the EQ settings in Audacity that I need. So if you just copy what this looks like by clicking where these dots are, what it's doing is reducing a lot of the low-end rumble. It's increasing the bass slightly. It's reducing some of the mid-range, and which you get a lot of kind of boxiness and room sound in this area. And it's increasing some of the top end to sort of brighten up the vocal. Now, the EQ that a vocal recording needs depends greatly on what the recording sounds like. But just for the sake of this video, I just want to give you a general idea and just something that works for most vocal recordings that I've found for podcasts. So we're going to click Apply, and you'll see that it's changed the shape of the waveform. If we solo that and listen now.
You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting.
And then before.
You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting.
It's just made it sound a little bit less boxy, a little bit more warm and professional and intimate. And now if we listen with the music.
You're listening to Podcasting Amplified, where our mission is to help you to leverage the power of podcasting to amplify your message and achieve your goals. If you're a podcaster and you want to learn from the journeys of other passionate podcasters, you're in the right place.
Okay, that's our podcast intro. And then it'll be a case of highlighting the whole thing, clicking File, Export, and exporting as a WAV file. And then you can save that wherever your podcast assets are going to be stored. And then the process for putting your outro together will be very similar. You'll be recording your outro script and adjusting the music as you see fit. And then as well as your intro and outro, you have some visual branding to put together. Now, this could be a logo for your podcast. It could be templates if you have a video podcast, or if you put together video shorts, templates to put your videos to. At the very minimum, you need cover art, which is a square picture that shows up. You'll have seen them on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and things that show up next to your podcast. That has the name of your podcast. It should make it easy to identify in the list of podcasts where yours is, it should stand out to potential listeners. The podcast artwork needs to be between 1400 by 1400 pixels and 3000 by 3000 pixels, ideally in a JPEG or PNG format, and at least in 72 DPI resolution and in an RGB color space. Now, you can either put this cover art together yourself using Photoshop or another graphic program if you know what you're doing in that field, or you can use something more simple like Canva to put your cover art together, or you can just outsource it to a designer. So just having a look on Apple Podcasts here, just so to give you an example of what your cover art could look like. I'm in the business news shows section here. A lot of these are quite professional, professionally done. They'll have big budget behind them. You've got BBC podcasts there and celebrity podcasts and things. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a big budget or yours has to be really sort of over-designed for it to stand out. I mean, if you scroll down here, one of them that stands out to me is this one, Algie's investment podcast. And it's very simple. The reason why it stands out for me is it's because it's very clear, the text on there, and also it's orange, and there aren't really any other just plain orange cover arts on here. So that's another way you could think about it. If you look in your niche, what do the other cover arts look like, and how can you make yours stand out? But the important thing is just to get something together that's clear and that stands out, because these show up really small on your screen and even smaller on a phone. And I find that some cover arts, although to the designer they may have looked great on a big screen, when they're really tiny, you can barely read what some of them are saying. If we find an example, for example, down here, like the top bit is absolutely fine, the Love My Dress podcast, so we can see what that's all about. But this text here, you can't read. It doesn't matter too much on this because you can see the title of the podcast, but I feel like it's just not really necessary to fill your cover art with loads of text. You can leave the description for that. And something simple like this here, Architecture Business Club on the right, is very clear what it is at a glance, and I think it stands out quite nicely. You can use a headshot of yourself. That's completely up to you. Faces do tend to attract the attention, but it's up to you if you want your face on there. And a lot of the best ones are ones that really take their brand into mind and use specific colours and fonts and don't overdo it. So here, for example, they've got their font that they've chosen and 2 colours, and I would presume that across the rest of their branding they're using this pink and purple just to cement that branding into the listener's mind when they see it on your social and everything. And then there we got The Economist, we've got the logo there, and just using their red and one simple font. Again, if you're outsourcing this, you don't have to worry too much because your designer's going to know what the best thing to do is here. But if you're designing it yourself, just try and think simple. The most important thing is that it stands out and that it's clear. So if we go into Canva now, actually, I'm just going to show you my podcast artwork for Podcasting Amplified. So if we zoom right out, you can see very clearly that it says Podcasting Amplified. You can't miss it. It's bright blue, really stands out, and I use this font across the rest of the content that I make for Podcasting Amplified. And then I've just added this little icon at the top to give it a bit more of a logo feel, and I can use that little icon that I got from Canva as icons on my website and things like that. There are other similar basic graphic design softwares that you can use for this. This is just the one that I happen to use, and a lot of them offer example templates. Again, I think some of these examples are a bit over-designed. Like, you don't need all this text that you can barely read. I mean, this is tiny and white on this kind of light color. Just think bold and simple if in doubt. And then this is entirely optional. You can also create a template that you can use for each individual episode. So if you want each episode to show up differently, so if we open iTunes again, so each of your episodes will have their own artwork that will show up. So if you want a headshot of your guest, for example, or you just want their name, or you just want like a little image that identifies the topic that you're going to be talking about, you can make a template. So for example, for mine, this is the main cover art, and this, I've just shrunk down the title a tiny bit and left space for the title of the episode, which I've tried to keep nice and catchy to get viewers' attention. If we zoom out on that one as well, you can still see the name of the podcast and the text for the episode. And then thirdly, again, this is entirely optional, but if you're posting your podcast on YouTube, then you're going to need a widescreen 16 by 9 resolution cover art template as well for each episode, or the thumbnail as YouTube would call it. So I've used the title of the podcast on the left there to grab people's attention, and then in this empty box there'll be a headshot of myself and the guest. And then thirdly, what we're going to go over in this video is how to put together a show notes template. Show notes are the descriptions of each episode of a podcast that show up below that episode in the podcast platforms like Spotify. It's a written description that should explain what's going to go on in that episode, why a potential listener should listen and stick around. And to save you time each episode, you want to put together a template that has all the important links that you're going to be adding to every single episode, and maybe just some prompts and a general framework of how you're going to write show notes for each episode. Let's take a look at the template for my show notes. Now, we're not going to be making your show notes in this stage. We're just going to be putting together a template. If we just go back into Apple Podcasts for a minute and have a look at, we've got all these episodes here, and each of them have their own description, and they have links. You can see at the bottom of this pop-up, there's some links to their websites as well. And the point of your show notes is to attract listeners to listen to it. So it has to be enticing. So typically I'd recommend including in your show notes an enticing few sentences to get the potential listener to click play. And this needs to be right up top at the beginning of your show notes. A couple of short paragraphs introducing any guests, summarizing the main points, bullet point list. It's important to get bullet points in there because most people won't be reading through big reams of text. They'll be just skimming it. Your call to action and links to where people can subscribe or for more information or for things mentioned in the episode. The biggest mistake I find podcasters do with writing their show notes is that they'll start their show notes for each episode in exactly the same way. And it'll be something like, in this episode of the Something podcast, we sit down with, and then because every single episode starts that way, and because you can only see a few words when listeners are scrolling through, that's basically what they'll see for every single episode. So there's no way it's going to grab them if it just says the same thing. If it just says, if this said, in this episode of Business Wars by Wondery, we're going to talk about, and that's all you could see, then there'd be nothing to entice you at least straight away. And people like to skim things and find out very quickly if they can get value from it. Whereas what they've done for this podcast is started to describe some kind of intriguing story, and it makes you want to read into it more. So just having a look at my template here. You can just write out a template just to use as a base for each episode, so you don't have to keep starting from scratch. So we're going for attention grabbing opening sentences, introducing the guest, adding some bullet points, then learn more. So we've got links to anything mentioned in the episode and the guest, links to where people can connect with me, and then where people can listen, because these links are going to be the same for every episode, a lot of them, and you don't want to have to find them all for each episode. So you can start with this template. Let's just have a quick look at some example show notes that I've written. Again, we're starting with something attention grabbing. Have you ever been told that you've changed the way someone thinks about something? I'm not saying that's an amazing opening or anything. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than in this episode, which you don't want every single time. And then we've got some bullet points, which just go over the main benefits that people are going to get from listening to the episode. Because again, most people skim, they don't read through the whole thing. And then it's got my links. So if you can put together a template that just has your links in and that gives you somewhere to start with writing your show notes, it will help save you a huge amount of time. And you can also repurpose these show notes. You can use them as the description when you post it on YouTube. You can use them as a blog post. You can use them as your intro. For example, after I've written my show notes, this is the chunk of copy that I record for the cold open, just again to save you time, because there's a lot of work keeping your podcast consistent.
And that's it. This stage is obviously much more involved. You've got to get things together in terms of music and put your cover art together and everything. If you have the budget, obviously you can outsource all of this and you don't have to do any of it. But otherwise, don't let not having a budget or not being a pro at putting all of this together stop you from starting your podcast. The most important thing is you get started, you're getting content out there. All of this can be updated, upgraded in the future. The next stage, stage 4, is creating your content, your first couple of episodes and your trailer. So hit that subscribe button or find it in the description linked below. And let me know in the comments section, what kind of cover art are you putting together? If you can, then link it. It'd be great to see some of your cover art. And also, what kind of music are you going to be using for your intro and outro that works for your podcast? And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.